All right, what time we got? We've got 10 past 5. So let's start kicking it off. For those who've just joined recently, no mai haere mai. I'm Isabella Cawthorne. I am the convener and editor of the Transport and Urban Form blog, Talk Wellington. We're also very lucky to have as our hosts Alicia Hall from Millions of Mothers and Melanie Vautier from the Tui Climate Community. And we're recording this session, so we're going to be able to send it out to the many people who really wanted to dial in this evening but couldn't make it, given things like families. And we're very lucky that Stuart has been able to make time from his very busy work and voluntary activities, including being a dad. So what we will do this evening, we're going to have a pretty basic webinar structure. Stu is going to talk to us about parking, and then we'll have some time for questions and discussion. Parking is a really hot topic at the moment. It's always a hot topic, to be honest, since the invention of the parkable vehicle and the invention of the city. It's especially hot topic right now. And so to help us all bring our best selves to this discussion and to all the different perspectives and new ideas that we'll be hearing, we'll just kick ourselves off with a little karakia, and then we're going to do a lightning round of introductions. So I will just do as a karakia. Feel free to speak along if you like. We'll just stay on mute. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, ki mā kina kina ki uta, ki mā taratara ki tai, he ake ana te atukura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihe mauri ora. So a quick welcome everyone. This is a fantastic turnout and speaks to how relevant and interesting parking is and what a hot topic it really is. So with very little further ado, we're going to pass the mic over to Stu. Please put questions for him in the chat bar, and we will, as soon as he is finished, we'll sort of pull together the questions and we'll start entering into a bit more of a Q&A type session, which will be facilitated. So Stu, please take it away. Tell us about parking.
Excellent. Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks Isabella, and thanks to Alicia and Melanie for helping organize. I'm just going to share my screen now, and hopefully that comes through okay. So can people see my screen? How's that working?
Looks good.
Looks good? Okay, let's jump into it then. So I really feel privileged to be here talking to you here in a modern sense. And this came together very quickly. So I want to apologize if it seems a little bit off the cuff in advance, but I really appreciate your passion and interest for parking. And today, here we go. Okay. So today what I'd like to talk about, and it may seem a bit odd, but I'll hopefully make it clear why. I want to start by talking about emotional experiences and how they shape parking policy. I don't know much about people's backgrounds, but if you're like me, then you come at these things from quite a technocratic perspective, and that's valid and useful. But what I've found, I guess, working over the last 15 years with parking policy is that you need to complement that approach and that perspective with an understanding of emotional experiences and how they affect policy. So I'm going to start with that. I'm not going to finish with that. Oh, before I get in, I should also say it's heartening to see a couple of people from Auckland. I'm originally from Waiuku, and you can call me Stu. So this is a very informal environment. In terms of the opportunity, so the second point on that list, I think a lot of you probably already know what the opportunity is with better parking policies and how they can transform your city. So I'm not going to dwell a lot on it, but I will provide some references to other things that you can read to, I guess, reinforce your understanding of that. But we can, you know, if you have questions about this opportunity, we can come back to it at the end. The third point there is around fast following or leapfrogging. And that's really trying to emphasize what you can learn from other cities. And there is a lot. There's a lot that we've learned over the last 15 years to 2 decades. So it's definitely not the case where you need to reinvent the wheel on parking policy. Of course, there are always differences between communities, but I do think there's some common elements that you can draw on from overseas. And finish with a few observations, some comments on common follies, parking fallacies, if you like, and some further reading. So the goal really from today is quite simple. I just hope to arouse your passion for parking policy. If that doesn't sound like a contradiction in terms. I'm particularly passionate about parking policy, and I hope you are too, or at least you are by the end of the talk. I'd like to really empower you to engage more readily and effectively with elected representatives, policymakers, and perhaps most importantly, your friends, family, and fellow residents. I really think we tend to underestimate the value of conversations that we might have with the people that we're close to. So hopefully you come out of this with some ideas about things you can talk to your friends and family about. So let's start with the emotion. My proposition is that emotion more than evidence shapes policy. And I think this is particularly true in parking. It's probably true more widely. But this image here is a Ferny Grove park and ride station. And this is a local park and ride at the end of a line in Brisbane, where I'm sitting. This little park and ride, it's about 1,000 spaces, became a national issue in Australia in the recent federal election. And I'll come back to what happened there. But this is a fairly recurrent theme across New Zealand, Australia, and probably further afield, although I've less experience in other places. Why? You know, I think the question is, why are people, why is parking policy so easily influenced by very short-term kind of thinking? I think it starts to make a lot more sense when you start by thinking about a common parking experience. So I'd just like to ask you to consider a situation where you're running late for an appointment, an important appointment. That could be, you know, dinner with your loved ones. It could be a dentist appointment. It could be a medical appointment. It could be a work meeting. And you need to find somewhere to park, but you can't. And so what do? And I think the answer is obvious. Most of us will simply keep searching to find a car park. But how does that make you feel when you are running late for an appointment that's important and you can't find a car park? I think almost universally, fairly frustrated and disempowered. Frustrated because you need to be where you need to be, and you don't know how long it will take for you to find a car park and what have you. But also disempowering, because in that moment you have almost zero choice about what you do. You've already gotten your car and you've already decided to drive. So in the short run, in the very, very short run, as an economist might say, you have no choice. And so you are effectively trapped in your car and you just have to keep driving until you find a car park. I think these emotional experiences of parking actually heavily influence policies on the ground. So that simple experience of being unable to find a car park is quite frustrating. And I think we would do a lot better with our parking policy reforms, and I'll come on to what those reforms might look like later, if we recognize those experiences, we validate them, and then we design our policies to try and address them. Now, that doesn't mean, and I'll highlight this later, providing more parking necessarily in almost any situation. But you can recognize and validate those emotions, and then talk about how your policies will seek to address them. So just coming back to this Ferny Grove park and ride that we started with, at the bottom here, I've just added some extracts from the press release that the local member released in the middle of a federal government election here. And if you just read this, you can start to get a sense for what the politicians are responding to. Quote, frustrated rail commuters unable to find parking at Ferny Grove Rail Station will benefit from an $11 million funding allocation for additional park and ride facilities. It's interesting here they talk about $11 million. It sounds like a big number, but when you're trying to build car parks, it actually isn't that many because parking is expensive, as I'm sure a lot of you know. And then the final sentence there, additional parking spaces are urgently needed at Ferny Grove Station, where commuters are now forced to find parking in adjoining streets, spreading the frustration to local residents. So you can see here how, you know, people's experience, frustrating experience on the ground has flowed through to influence federal government policy. Quite amazing. Moving on to Wellington, coming a little bit closer to where most of you are sitting. Space is in short supply, and that really is the crux of the opportunity that you have with parking. Of all the cities where I've lived, Wellington is the most space constrained. Sorry, I haven't lived in Wellington, but of all, you know, of all the cities where compared to the cities where I've lived, Wellington is far more space constrained. Auckland is fairly space constrained, but not to the extent that Wellington is. And that's the opportunity. Since World War II, in the 7 decades or so since World War II, parking policies have really caused a lot of damage. It's unintentional, but I think it's fairly evident. That damage is both socioeconomic in the sense that they've undermined the prosperity of our cities, and it's also psychological in the sense that they've cultivated what I would say is an unrealistic expectation or entitlement to free parking. More recently, a lot of cities, and I would put Wellington in this category, have come to realize that space is scarce and parking is space intensive. So that realization, the fact that you don't have a lot of space and that parking takes up a lot of space, has really started to inform our policy and led to the removal of minimum parking requirements in some areas and charging for parking. So the opportunity, and I use these parentheses here deliberately, the opportunity arises from the fact that parking policies, parking itself takes up a lot of space. So if you can make more efficient use of that space, then that's very valuable. So I think the key opportunity really is just that parking policies can help us use space more efficiently. And that's, yeah, I think that's really the starting point. I want to emphasize here, in a lot of discussions of parking policy, people immediately focus on the transport system, and there are some very important transport effects from parking policy. But the most direct effect from a lot of our policies is really around land and space, and that's the direct effect of these policies. And space is very valuable, and when you work through some of the benefits and costs of better parking policies, which we did in Auckland, and I can talk more about that if you're interested in the details. But what we found is when you looked at the land use benefits of more efficient parking policies, they outweighed the transport benefits by a factor of 9. So the land use benefits of more efficient parking policies are 9 times larger than the transport benefits. The transport benefits are still significant. I don't want to downplay those, but it's definitely the land use side of things where you see most of the gains. That's where the opportunity is. In this space, I think Wellington is very fortunate. You're coming into reform a parking policy that I think previously was written in 2007. In the time since that policy was adopted, Auckland has blazed the trail for you. And I'm biased because I'm from Auckland and I've worked there, and I guess I've contributed to those policies in a small way. But Auckland has done really well. And there are other peer cities, I'll talk about them. But you can learn a lot from Auckland. It's blazed the trail not just in parking policy, but the sort of growth that you've seen in Auckland. This figure here, which I want to thank Matt Lowry at Greater Auckland. He sent it to me at around 1 o'clock in the morning last night. Shows the growth in the population in Auckland city centre over the last sort of 25 years or so, 25 years. You can see its population's gone from under 5,000 to over 35,000. It's growing extremely rapidly. It's one of the fastest growing parts of New Zealand in a population sense. That sort of growth is fairly similar to what Wellington is expecting in the next few decades. So what Auckland's sort of seeing the growth that you're expecting to see in Wellington city centre over the next few years. In about the late 90s, they removed minimum parking requirements in Auckland city centre, similar to what Wellington did. I think Wellington might have actually led the way by a couple of years on this, but Auckland followed in the late 90s. And then progressively through the 2000s and especially from 2010 onwards with the amalgamation of councils and the formation of Auckland Council and Auckland Transport, they've really accelerated their rollout of new parking policies. And I'm not suggesting that those policies have supported this growth, but this growth has necessitated the uptake of those policies. If they had not reformed their parking policies, then this growth would have led to some quite significant problems, I think, on the street. So they've managed to keep up. And this is the situation, I think, from reading the draft parking policy proposal from Wellington City Council, it seems like a fairly similar situation to what Wellington's in. The effect of those parking policy reforms has really been, if you want to think about it in a simple technocratic sense, to close the gap between what parking costs to provide and what people pay for it. The blue line here shows the estimated parking cost to council for one of their off-street car parks. This is the total economic cost, so includes the value of the land or the space. And then the orange line shows the cost that the price that they're charging to users. And you can see that, especially since 2012 onwards, the gap has really narrowed. So what council have effectively done, Auckland Transport, sorry, in this case, is close the gap between what parking is worth and what they charge for it. They still charge less than what it costs and what it should be. So they're heading in the right direction. Their ability to change prices like this was really enabled by a wider package of policy reforms. So you can't just go out and change the price of parking overnight. You have to actually create the conditions in which it makes sense to charge the market price for parking. At least, I would say. And we can come back to why I think you should charge at least the market price for parking. And just to show you how Auckland Transport really approached the parking policy, reforming their parking policy, I think this is really useful. This is an extract from their parking strategy. It's online, you can download it. And in that parking strategy, it has a lot of policies. This is policy 1C, this extract, which is to do with demand responsive priced parking, on-street parking. What I've underlined here is a couple of, I think, really interesting points that they're making here. If you look through these bullet points, you see the first bullet point says prices for on-street parking will be set at levels that ensure people can find a car park most of the time within a short walking distance of their destination. So this policy is very clear about what their prices are trying to do. Their prices are trying to deliver a certain experience that they think is desirable for people on the ground. Then they go on in the second bullet point to talk about if the demand for parking in an area goes down, then they expect prices will go down, and vice versa, and that they're going to regularly monitor the parking to ensure that the prices are resulting in an appropriate level of occupancy. So that's really sort of saying we're going to use prices to deliver this experience. They do talk about priorities in the third bullet point, and they say we do want to prioritize customers and other short-term visitors ahead of long-stay commuters. And then they sort of bring in this point that prices are more effective than time limits at achieving those priorities. The final bullet point is really about evidence. So they've talked about policies, they've talked about experience that they want to deliver, and then the final bullet point here is about evidence. The way that they set parking prices in different parts of Auckland should be transparent and based on up-to-date empirical evidence of parking demand patterns and observed trends. These are not empty words, I should emphasize. In other parts of the strategy, they actually say what is their target utilization and the process that Auckland Transport is going to use to adjust prices, and how they will revisit prices every 3 months or over a certain time period. And I think this is really, really useful because it really does try and link, I think, the policy to the evidence. Now, there's no citations here, but I can give you those citations, and they are actually provided in other parts of the strategy. So it links the policy to the evidence to the experience. And that's, I think, an area where we can do a lot better. It's an area where I also struggled, especially initially. But I think if we want to make progress, more rapid progress, this is a kind of this is something we need to focus on. Another example is from San Francisco, and some of you may have already been familiar with what San Francisco did, but for those who aren't, just quickly, San Francisco got a large federal grant of about $100 million to research on-street parking and the management of on-street parking. And they, in particular, they were interested in how they could use prices to optimize the use of on-street parking. And without going into a lot of detail, this trial was very well resourced through the federal government and collected amazing data. And all of that data is publicly available on the SF Park website. There's also a summary of the outcomes of the trial, which is pretty amazing. And I just want to highlight some of these outcomes for you. What San Francisco found is that if you use prices to achieve a sort of target utilization level, you can drastically reduce the time that people spend searching for a car park. So on average, there was about a 30% decrease in time spent searching for a car park in the pilot area compared to the control area. So that's saving people around 4 to 5 minutes. It's pretty huge. On every person looking for a car park, saves 4 to 5 minutes. Vehicle miles traveled reduced by about a quarter. Carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, decreased by about a quarter as well. And here's a real interesting point, which I won't give you the answer to, but we can come back to it if people are interested in. The average price actually went down in San Francisco from before to after. So they found through the optimization of their prices to achieve a certain level of demand, utilization rather, they were able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and vehicle travel with lower prices. And I'll just let that sit for a while. The next outcome they found is that when they moved to more of a price-based parking management regime rather than using time limits, there was a significant reduction in the number of parking citations or parking tickets issued, around 10% fewer, comparing the pilot to the control. So, you know, it's very hard to find a loser in this context. And that final figure there about how often were the blocks of parking too full, they found there are about 30% fewer instances of parking of the blocks being full, to the point where people couldn't really easily find a car park. Really, really interesting, really, really solid evidence base for us to draw on. So more generally, what are the things I've found from other cities that I think Wellington can learn from rather? I think one of the key things I've noticed is this positive feedback loop between better management of parking and support for further reforms. And this is one thing that Auckland did amazingly well. And they did amazingly well because they had a bunch of really great people in the right places in different organizations. So there was a bit of luck. But what they did is they started by trials. So they just implemented a couple of trials. There were areas where it was difficult to find a car park. People were unhappy, the businesses were complaining. And they just said, look, what we want to do is these areas actually had a 2-hour time limit. So they were free, but you could park for 2 hours, and there was just too much demand. And there was a question, the question was, do we shorten the time limits further? Do we go to a P60, say, or do we actually start charging for parking? A lot of the businesses wanted to go to a P60. Auckland City Council actually at that time felt like prices were a better way to go. So what they did is they convinced the business association to let them run a trial for 3 months, where they removed time limits and they put in place priced parking. And they just collected a lot of data and compared the before and after. And they got very similar outcomes to San Francisco. And they were able to show the business association that with priced parking, they got higher turnover than what they did with price parking and no time limits, delivered higher turnover than the time limits, the 2-hour time limits on their own. And that was really compelling. And they've repeated that sort of experience in several other areas. And then they got to the point where business associations, people with these business associations who had basically said that the council would install parking meters over their dead body, actually switched sides and vocally supported the implementation of pricing. So I think the main message here is you can learn from the experience of other cities, and when you start to manage parking better, you build the case, you build support for further reforms. It's very much a virtuous cycle, and that's where Auckland's gone. And those reforms don't just extend to sort of public parking, how you manage public parking, but also district plan reforms around minimum parking requirements and stuff like that. So the main messages, I guess, for public parking is that prices are considerably more effective than time limits across pretty much every dimension you can look at. And if there's people interested in the equity implications of that, then we can talk about that at the end. For off-street parking, I think the main message is that you don't need minimum parking requirements at all. And the evidence on that is really solid. And it's a struggle for some people to get their head around, but if you, and I think this is really important, if you're managing public parking effectively in the way that the evidence supports, then there really is no role for minimum parking requirements that force developers to provide off-street parking. And the third point here is that technology is really helping, especially with regards to pricing and enforcement. And actually, Wellington already does pretty well, I think, with technology in terms of they have sensors in their car parks and things like that. And that was a big lesson from San Francisco. I think one of the interesting things about Auckland is that they basically adopted the San Francisco model, but they didn't really spend much. You know, they didn't have $100 million from the government, from central government, to test parking management measures. They did it on the cheap. So rather than having fancy parking meters and fancy parking sensors, Auckland Transport just regularly surveyed, got some students to regularly survey parking, and if there was insufficient availability, they would increase prices a notch. So you can do quite a lot without having fancy technology. I think the question, this is a question more than a statement I want to finish with here, is that is Wellington just a fast follower, or can you or do you need to leapfrog into the lead? I don't know what the answer to this is, but I think you need to make a choice, because when I read the draft parking policy proposal, it reads to me like you're following, which is fine, but it doesn't really give me the sense that you're going to go ahead. And that's fine. It just means that parking policy is not necessarily going to give Wellington a competitive advantage over, say, Auckland, because what's being proposed is what Auckland's been doing for 5 or 10 years. And so they're further along. So, you know, the question in my mind is perhaps you need to go a bit harder to catch up. But obviously you need to weigh against that what people will support. Some of you may recognize this image. It's one of my favorite parts of the country. It's from Hahei on the Coromandel Peninsula. It's Cathedral Cove, if people don't recognize it. It's an incredibly popular visitor destination in a relatively rural area. I mean, there's a small beach settlement at Hahei, but for years the parking here was a debacle. And there was a dock had a parking area at the top of the hill. Everyone would drive up the hill, find the car parks were full, and then end up driving back down and parking all over the place. And what the council did here is and I think they worked with DOC. I actually don't know the details of the backstory, but the outcome was that they started charging for parking at the top. I think it's $10 for 4 hours, or I don't remember the details, but a reasonable amount. They started charging for parking, except for mobility users. And then the council came in and provided a park and ride at the bottom of the hill in a paddock, effectively. So as you come into Hahei now, you can turn off into this paddock if it's peak visitor time, and you can park there, and I think for $5 there's a bus that takes you to the top of the hill. So really, you know, really encouraging. This has been in the last 5 or so years that this has happened. But interestingly, what has also happened is that in response to all of these policy changes, a private landowner who also has access to this recreation area has also started offering parking, making their fields available for people to park in and charging people for that. So it's, you know, it's a parking policy dream in some sense. I mean, you know, the councils take steps working with DOC to manage parking more efficiently, and then you see a private sector response. And it's now much easier to go to Cathedral Cove. Yes, you have to pay a little bit, but it's you don't get stuck in terrible congestion, and the parking is much better managed. So some observations from reading Wellington's draft parking policy proposal. I want to be clear here that I'm not an expert on Wellington, and I don't pretend to be. But from reading the draft parking policy proposal, it does seem to move in what I would call the right direction based on the evidence that I've read. I find it tends to emphasize policy rather than experiences and evidence. And I guess that's okay, given that it's a parking policy proposal. But I would really encourage you in your submissions, if you're advocating for changes, that you draw on experiences and evidence to support the policy positions that you're taking. A little bit more like Auckland Transport did in their parking strategy. I think those latter two things are critical. You know, you can try and treat parking as a dry policy issue, but I think you do so at your peril. So, you know, the technocratic side of me would love to think it's just a dry policy issue, but it's not. And you could come up with a great policy, but, and I think we can probably all think of policy documents that are like this, that are great policy documents. But if they don't speak to people's experiences and link the policy to evidence and experience, then they tend to be ignored by council, by elected representatives. So I'd really encourage people to move beyond the policy and be clear about how their policy seeks to deliver the sorts of experiences that you think is supported, that people want and is supported by the evidence. I've got some specific comments there. I don't think we need to go through them, but you can read them afterwards if you're interested. So getting to the end now, before we open it up for questions, some common follies down the left-hand side of this table. And what I've done here is I've tried to provide what I've described as a technocratic response. And that's my natural habitat. You know, that's where I live. I love technocratic policy and especially economic arguments. And then in the final column to the right, I've tried to provide a more intuitive response. And I think you need both, I guess, is the main point. I think you need to, when you're addressing concerns or, you know, opposition to reforms from the community, I think it's good to have both in your back pocket. It's good to understand both. But I would lead with the intuition. I would recommend you lead with the intuition, and then depending on who you're talking to, back it up with a more technocratic kind of perspective. I think both are valid. But just for example, someone who says there's not enough parking, the intuitive response to that is, yes, it's very frustrating when you can't find a car park. And these policies seek to ensure that car parks are always available when and where they're needed. The second folly there, the price of parking is too high. Yes, we should set prices to ensure parking space are well used, but not oversaturated. Empty car parks don't really benefit anyone. And in many situations, this was actually something that Auckland Transport were very clear on in their demand responsive parking policy, is that in many situations, the right price for parking may be zero. It's just that we don't assume the right price is zero. And the third point there, which is really more about off-street parking, around developers won't provide parking. I think it's fair to intuitively to acknowledge that new development can result in increased pressure on public parking. The question is how you respond to that. You know, is the best policy response to just require developers to provide parking, or is it better to adopt policies that reduce the pressure that's placed on public parking? And I very much advocate for the latter. Some further reading with some links here. You can really trace sort of the evolution in people's thought. Todd Littman and Donald Shoup wrote a couple of books in the mid-2000s, Parking Management Best Practice, The High Cost of Free Parking, that's been updated. There's the SF Park, project evaluation summary document. It's well worth a read. It's really quite short and has lots of pretty pictures. Auckland Transport's on and off-street parking strategy. And then a recent book that I contributed a chapter to, along with, I think, Paul Barter's on the line. It's really just, it's a series of case studies of cities around the world and some of their approaches to parking and their situation. And this final one here, it's a bit left field, but if you want to if you want to diversify your parking policy literature with some literature on moral psychology, there's a book called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, written by a guy called Jonathan Haidt. He's got some TED Talks as well, if that's your preferred medium. I would say good people are also divided by parking. And a lot of the material in there is quite relevant for a lot of public engagement type things. One of the things he says, this is where I'll finish before we open it up to questions. Intuitions first, reasoning second. And Jonathan says, keep your eye on the intuitions and don't take people's moral arguments at face value. They're mostly post hoc constructions made up on the fly, crafted to advance one or more strategic objectives. This applies as equally to me as it does to the people I'm trying to convince. But I think it's useful to keep in mind. So that's really all I managed to pull together. But let's have a chat. How shall we do this, Isabella? I can see see a whole lot of questions going up.
Yeah. Firstly, thank you very much, Stu. And folks, let's just do a silent round of applause for Stu for that excellent overview of a very rich and complex area. The questions have been coming through thick and fast. They are very diverse, and Alicia and Mel have been parsing them and grouping them to themes, which is brilliant. So just very quickly, I owe Stu an apology. I was supposed to introduce him with his professional bio, and you will have obviously heard him speaking with a lot of insight that will give you a hint as to his professional background. He's got master's degrees in engineering and economics, and he's currently studying towards a PhD in economics. And his areas of consulting expertise are economics of space, transport and urban areas, multimodal transport planning and policy development. And he's worked all around the place, and lots throughout Australasia. And in his home time, he's also written some pretty great pieces on the Greater Auckland blog, which I will also suggest we add to the further reading list. So, having got that out of the way, can we first start with a clarification question? And there's been a good question here. Could you just unpack a little bit more for us how pricing parking affects land use?
Mm-hmm. So, I guess just to preface this response, it's a very broad question, but the current situation is that we have policies that force developers to provide a certain amount of parking off-street. So if we're talking about off-street parking, then what we're currently doing is forcing developers to provide a quantity of parking that we think is about right to meet the demand for free parking. So our district plan policies are almost bake in the assumption of free parking. And so they try and meet the 95th percentile or the 90th percentile or whatever. That's an excessive amount of parking, and that assumption is ridiculous. That's my contention, and I think we need to confront that reality. That there's no reason why we should expect parking to be free. There's no reason why we should force developers to provide large amounts of free parking. The reasons I've seen advanced for it they're classic Jonathan Haidt kind of situations. I mean, and just to give you an example, one of the reasons I've seen for off-street parking requirements is that they improve street amenity because you get the cars off the street. I mean, okay, maybe, But I mean, in the meantime, you've created a vast area of off-street car parking, which is also typically quite ugly. So I guess the answer to that question is, if you start to price parking and you manage public parking better, and you remove these off-street car parking requirements, then you allow development to provide fewer car parks. Yeah, you basically change the composition of development, you know, rather than at the moment, rather than about 50% of developable land being used for car parking, they will use less land, and they will find ways to manage the parking they do provide. So that's the short answer. It's not very short. Apologies about that. But if people had more specific questions about land use, then I guess we could, you know, could go in more detail on that.
Yeah, we have had a few follow-up ones, and there's the comment you made at the beginning that parking policy is actually more about land and the use of space rather than transport. And you made this quite startling observation that the benefits from good parking policy are about 9-to-1, land use benefits to transport benefits. That was pretty amazing. Reading Wellington's policy, there's an observation I'd make, I don't know if other people share it, but our policy feels quite transport centric rather than being land use centric. And I know from conversations with quite a lot of commentators and politicians, our rhetoric is very transport centric. Amongst other things, there's this idea that people have to flow into the city and find a park that extends right up into the wider Wellington region, and this idea that the new roads are going to bring a tsunami, I think was one councillor's word, a tsunami of cars coming down on the city, which all need to find parks. So we've got a bit of a pressure towards thinking about our parking policy as a transport issue. What do you think how could we reframe that?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think it's really hard for policymakers when they're looking to review their parking management policies, you know, because the off-street parking requirements sit in the district plan, so they're actually quite a separate policy instrument. And in the draft proposal from Wellington City, there is a reference to the district plan review and parking requirements. So, you know, they have kind of acknowledged it and sort of said it's out of scope. I think what I would say is that if you get your public parking management going well, it builds the case for reforming off-street policies. So it's definitely what's being proposed and moving in the right direction is definitely worth doing, even if you acknowledge that there's a need for further reforms to the district plan later on. So yeah, definitely what's in the document at the moment is not enough, but I can understand why they've scoped it this way. And I guess that what you need to keep a lookout for is the district plan review. And I don't want to scare you by the need to do more submissions, but you should really support what's being proposed, and you know, probably with some caveats, of course, and with some suggestions, while also acknowledging that there's more work to do. That's where it played out in Auckland.
Now we've had a few questions around the theme of transition, and there are probably two related questions in here, so I'll ask them both and then you pick off whichever one you want to do first. The first one is this notion that there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. We are currently in quite a car-centric transport system, which means that other options like public transport aren't very strong. They aren't genuine equivalent choices for people at the moment. So there's this question around how do you transition people away from driving into the city when the alternatives aren't very good yet? So that's question one. And then question two is an equity one. And we've had a lot of interest in this. What are the genuine equity issues that need to be properly addressed and might legitimize a slower transition? And which are, this isn't the right wording, but which are kind of fake equity issues that people are using as a Trojan horse for just stopping change. So yeah. Firstly, okay, so like an infrastructure transition question, and then an equity transition question.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's good. So the transition, I guess, just reinforcing my point that the main gain from these parking policy reforms will be land use on the land use side. But putting that to one side and focusing on the transport effects. The question about alternatives is quite interesting because if you look at Wellington's per capita use of PT, public transport, and cycling, it's far higher than Auckland. So I guess the question you need to ask yourself is that really a barrier to these kinds of reforms? Obviously, it's ideal. Ideally, you'd have way better alternatives than what you currently have. But you already seem to have much higher use of non-car modes than Auckland. So to give you a point of comparison, when Auckland started these policy reforms, they were running at about 50 PT trips per capita per year. Wellington has been at around about 80 PT trips per capita per year for the last decade or so. It's gone up and down a bit, but it's generally stayed about constant. So your levels of public transport use are just 60% higher than Auckland. And I think your cycling mode share is also higher than Auckland. So is it really true that that you need better infrastructure? I don't know. I think the answer is probably a yes in some areas. But I wouldn't let that slow you down, because these things take a long time to work through the system. Like if you think of, look at San Francisco, they started optimizing their parking prices, and their prices actually came down. If you look at the district plan, if you propose to change minimum parking requirements now, it'll be 3 or 4 years before that comes into an effect. And even at that point, it's only going to apply to new developments. It's not going to apply to all of the existing developments. So it's not like you're going to go from a situation of having lots of parking to no parking in a couple of years. I think that's really important to thinking about this transition around infrastructure, is that, when the day that minimum parking requirements are removed, you will still have every single car park that you currently have. And that's possibly a little bit too many, a few too many. So I really think that's the line I take, is that yes, we need to transition our infrastructure, but we can transition our infrastructure at the same time as we transition our parking policies, because the effects of these parking policies are so slow. They're so slow. That doesn't mean they're not worth doing. It just means you need to, I would really encourage you to start now as early as possible. So that's the infrastructure transition. If we can move on, what was the second point?
Second one was about equity, and there are lots of people going, particularly like residence parking has been one thing, but also inner city parking for people who live outside the city and in very car dependent areas. So at the beginning of their journey, they have no choice but to jump in a car, and then for whatever reason they decide not to shift to another mode halfway through. So there's those people. Then there's the people in areas inner city areas that have residence parking, currently priced very low, as our friend Olive Bruce has helpfully laid out. And the idea, there's a lot of fear amongst those people, and councillors are, using that to its utmost, that increasing residence parking charges is unfair for them, and that they should be compensated in some way. And I note that in the parking policy proposal, the further out in spatial terms from the core, the higher up they suggest residence parking should go as a priority for space. So can you comment on these equity issues?
Definitely. I think the equity issues is a really important question, and I think it's worth diving into in detail. Just from the outset, I think it's implausible to suggest that if you start charging for parking in the way that I'd suggest you do, like Auckland and San Francisco, it's implausible to think that there will be no low-income households affected. There will be some low-income households affected by those changes. The question I ask myself is, how badly are they affected, and on average, who are they affected more or less than high-income households? Just pointing to the San Francisco example, the reason that when they adopted this approach, the reason that prices went down is because compliance increased. So previously, there were a lot of cars parking on the street that weren't complying, and they weren't paying for parking. So those cars that weren't complying, they didn't care what the price of parking was. They were just taking the risk of getting a ticket, right? So the price for them was effectively zero, unless they got caught, and then it was whatever the citation, the fine, the parking ticket fine was. So when they brought in this demand-based approach, which, you know, got rid of time limits and focused on just using prices, prices are way easier to enforce. So what happened is that compliance went up. They didn't need to issue as many citations, which you saw. And they actually achieved a demand reduction while also at peak times, while also reducing prices. So in that case, everyone's kind of better off. You know, I mean, assuming that low income households are paying about the same as, on average, the same as everyone else. So that's one aspect of the equity situation, is that it's not, if you adopt a demand responsive parking policy, it's not clear that prices go up on average, and it's not clear that low-income households pay more. I think the second response, the second thing I would say about the equity issue, is that 10% of households in Wellington don't own a car. Those households are disproportionately low income. So it's not quite true that anyone who owns a car is doing well, but it is reasonably safe to say that the people who are really struggling and income constrained are much more likely to not own a car. So yes, there will be some people, low-income households, driving in from further out and what have you. You know, they may be negatively affected if prices go up. But there's a lot of low-income households that don't own vehicles or that don't use vehicles very much. And the way that we currently manage parking means that the costs of all the parking get passed on to everyone equally. And on average, low-income households use less parking and drive less and own fewer cars than high-income households. So on average, the subsidy that we've baked into our land use and transport system, the subsidy for parking, a disproportionate amount of that subsidy is flowing to high-income households. So, you know, I do think the equity issue is really important to think about. It's you know, there will be people who are adversely affected, and you might need to think about how to address effects on them. But I think, you know, on average, the cost is going to fall on high income households, if at all, if prices go up. Yeah. So is that, okay. Yeah, is that a good sort of way?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I would like to ask a question around suburbs versus central city, and I suppose to a certain extent this comes to the land use question, but also you may or may not know that Wellington has recently done a big consultation on our planning for growth, and the overwhelming result, actually, from lots and lots of submissions, I'm sure from some people in this conversation, was that people wanted to see, rather than greenfield growth, they wanted to see intensification both of the central city, like sort of Pornicky area, and also of our existing suburban centres. Now, one of the things that tends to characterise the way we think about suburban centres at the moment is that they are less dense, there's more space, we have I guess we get a bit stroppier if we're asked to pay for parking in suburban centres. And then you can run that argument out to its extreme and look at places like, let's say, Paraparaumu, which is essentially a giant strip mall where you can drive right up to the door of every single shop that you want to go to. And you would be clambering over a lot of dead bodies if you wanted to charge for parking in Paraparaumu. You know, you can also say that that's a pretty shit place to be, generally speaking. Apologies to anyone who actually lives there. So could you speak perhaps to this gradient between like a really intensely used city centre versus suburban centres, which aren't very dense and lively yet, but we want them to be? How do we sort of start convincing people that if the
well, I think there's a couple of things there. One of the things I would point out with the resistance to paying for parking is that historically there's been quite high, it's actually been quite inconvenient to pay for parking. You know, once you park, you have to get out, find the meter, put in coins. I mean, I know recently, in the last few years, they've moved to allowing you to pay by credit card and possibly also by phone. But more recently, we can now use apps. And at the moment, I think about 50% of all transactions for parking in Auckland are through the app. So it's much easier than what it used to be. And what you find is that people's resistance to paying for parking was partly, not entirely, but partly due to how inconvenient it was and how much of a pain it was to actually, have the right coins, for example. So that's one thing, is that this is where technology is our friend. It's making it easier to charge people a little bit for parking, and it's not so much of a pain. I think the second thing around these outlying centres, and it relates to what we talked about earlier about the rate of change, is that these things are not going to change overnight. You're not going to go to paying for $10 a day or in Porirua or some of these outlying centres. What you might start to see though is, as they gradually intensify, and development is a gradual process, possibly even a stagnant process as we're in the middle of a pandemic, but it's a gradual process. So what you would see in Parapara, in places like Porirua, is probably some fairly soft management measures coming out initially. So one of those management measures might be validated parking, where you get free parking if you spend more than $10, say, right? Or more, you pick some low amount. And that's actually, that might be where it ends, and all it's designed to do is ensure that those car parks are available for shoppers and really aren't used by commuters. And maybe that's as far as you need to go. It really depends on how fast and how far these centres develop. But it's not kind of like you're taking Porirua and making it into Sydney City, centre, where parking is $100 a day or whatever. That's not going to happen unless Porirua turns into that level of density. Yeah, so that's another thing I think, where when you engage with these arguments, people typically think that there's very little distinction between a policy change and what it means on the ground. And the policy changes we make now probably won't flow through to big changes on the ground for 5 or 10 years, even at the earliest.
Now, sorry,
no, was there another question you had? I think there was a question, you made a comment earlier about residential parking permits.
Yeah, we've had a few sort of questions around that, and I think that's going to be one of the more controversial areas in the policy, just because I think that's where there may potentially be the biggest changes coming. And at the moment, we've got this argument running that the council can't charge more than the cost.
Yeah,
and that's in the Local Government Act, apparently.
Yes.
And that is not defined as the opportunity cost of land.
No.
Can you speak to the Auckland experience? Are we going to have to wait for a national legislation change before we can do anything there?
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is yes, the Local Government Act is a barrier, and basically the terminology it uses is that councils can charge an admin fee for parking permits. That does not seem, there's differences in legal opinion on this, but I guess the risk is if you did try and charge more for residential parking permits, that you'd probably end up in court, and then you'd end up spending a lot of money on lawyers and stuff. So it's challenging. I think I'm not sure it requires a major legislative change. Once again, I'm not a lawyer, but I've heard some people say that it could just be gazetted as a small amendment, and the government actually puts through a lot of amendments every year to legislation where they make minor changes. So I guess it would, short answer is probably I think we do need a legislative change to charge more for residential parking permits. But I don't think it's a major. I think it could be quite efficient. We just need to get people on side with it.
Yeah.
But I think it's really worth putting aside the legislative question. I really do think we need to push back a little bit on this, the sense that people are entitled to heavily discounted car parking around their house. Like, I don't get free public transport in my local neighborhood. You know, like we don't manage any other part of the transport system this way. I mean, some people might say you should, but I'm not so sure. And at least in the current context, it seems weird that we would give heavily discounted residential parking permits to people that enable them to park in their neighborhood. But you know, what I would say, and I think, you know, from a policy perspective, I'd say, what are residential parking permits trying to do? And I think to me, it seems like they're trying to help solve an issue where people might not have parking off street, and that's a valid issue. They need to get parking somewhere, and you know, it makes sense to sell them an annual pass. That's really the way I see a residential parking permit. It's like an annual pass for public transport. It's something that you buy once and you have it and you never have to worry about it again. And that has a value, you know, and it's valuable to the person because they don't have to worry about all these individual transactions and paying on the app and paying at the meter or whatever. They get a pass, they can park forever for that year. It's also valuable to the council because it means that they get one lump sum of money. But, you know, like with annual public transport passes, we usually price them at about 50% or 60% or 70% of, say, the price if you pay for the year and monthly tickets or whatever it is. So it's like, I do agree that residential parking permits should be discounted to an extent, but that discount should reflect the convenience factor and the bulk buy factor. It's not, you're not discounting it because people have some sort of entitlement to free parking. You know, like that's we just don't have enough parking for that typically. Yeah, so that's where I end up. I've got some specific comments in the slides on the parking permit aspect of the draft proposal, and people, you know, might want to read that. But the thing that struck me is that they've come up with Wellington City has proposed a prioritization list, but it doesn't actually say if it doesn't say what the price is, and that's possibly because of this legislative issue. But I think more importantly, it doesn't say how parking permits are going to be managed year to year, right? So if you get a parking permit one year because there wasn't much demand, and then next year, let's say there's more demand from people who are higher on the priority list than you, like say they're in a pre-1920s house with no off-street parking, so they come in at a higher priority. Does that mean that those people will then get a permit and people who currently have a permit will not have a permit? Because that could be a valid position, but it's going to be controversial, and it's going to be, you know, I think they need to think explicitly about that, because the alternative is that everyone who gets a permit holds it forever. And that also creates problems. One of the cities I've lived for a while is Amsterdam, and they had a sort of a wait list for residential parking permits. Their parking permits cost €1,000 for every 6 months, so €2,000 a year. So residential parking permit in Amsterdam cost about $3,500, but they still had a wait list, and that wait list was so long that it was apparently got to 5 years. People have been waiting on the wait list for 5 years. And there were examples of people who died on the wait list and all sorts of horrible things like that. So, you know, these things are really tricky. Is that if you have a limited supply and you offer people discounted parking, which tends to be the way that residential parking permit schemes go at the moment, is you tend to get excessive demand, and then you have to find some other way to manage that demand, especially if you're not going to use prices. And so that typically is a queue, and that's what a wait list is. It's just a queue of people, right? And then the queues get really long. So, you know, so it's a struggle. Residential parking permits are a struggle.
Now, you've raised a really good point there about the benchmark against which a city should peg its residential parking permit costs, and you mentioned the convenience factor and the bulk buy factor. I'm aware that some of the various advocacy groups around Wellington have been getting some advice on submissions, bit of submissions guide work going on. And one of the suggestions I gather was that if you don't want to get a residence parking permit for your home, then you should be rewarded in some way. For example, with with some kind of carrot. like a public transport pass, yearly public transport pass, or even a bike hire or a scooter or something like that. Have you got any quick comments on that? Because we're
I'd need to study the proposal in more detail. It's quite hard to say off the cuff. I guess my fear is that it's just indulging the current sense of entitlement that people have for free parking. Is that, you know, the response to people's expectation for free parking is that we then go and give them other free stuff. And, you know, maybe if that free stuff is can be provided sustainably, but I have no issue with that. And free stuff for low income households may be useful, but I'm not sure I would link the free public transport to whether or not you get a parking permit. I personally would rather free public transport was just given to everyone who's mowing. You know, like whether you need a parking permit. Personally, I mean, that's, you know, it's getting slightly beyond parking policy, but I think the issue that they identify that they're trying to respond to is real, which is that when you offer these residential parking permit schemes and they're cheap, then typically everyone applies for the maximum quota. So everyone gets the maximum number of parking permits they can, and then they give them to their friends or visitors that they have, right? So that, you know, you have one for yourself and you have one for your visitors, and when your visitors turn up, you give it to them. I should say, of course, there's ways to manage this better. There's, you know, you can more sophisticated enforcement now. So, but the general problem is you get excessive demand. So that's a real problem.
We're bearing down on the end of our session, which is so frustrating because there's so many more good questions to ask and hear from you on. We've got a theme of questions around mobility parking. One question on park and ride, and I'd really just like you to finish with a sort of a forward-looking sort of message to us. So could you tackle those in order? Mobility parking, is that the exception to an entitlement to park?
I think so. Yeah, I have no problem with mobility spaces. I think it's there's very obvious reasons why you might want to provide dedicated mobility spaces, and it's not just because of the situation of the person, but it's just their needs. You know, like mobility spaces in Brisbane here have, for example, a wheelchair ramp. So you actually kind of need specifically designed mobility spaces, I think, and they might be larger as well. So to make it easy to get in and out of the car. So I have no problem with dedicated mobility spaces. I think the more interesting thing for me is around loading bays and so sort of loading. And the way that Auckland got around this, which I think is quite clever, and I think it's working quite well, was to basically, they have a 15-minute grace period. So the first 15 minutes that you park is free, even in the city centre, on street, I think. And I think they still have this. And the idea there was, we want to get around having lots of different loading bays, and having these sort of P5 or P10 or P15. There were a lot of very complicated sort of management policies designed to just facilitate these short pickup and drop-offs. And so what they did in Auckland is they just said, we'll have a 15-minute grace period where parking's free. And that basically means that every on-street car park becomes a pickup and a drop-off point. And you get around this need to have dedicated pickup and drop-offs. And I think that was quite neat. Yeah.
Quick supplementary on that one. Does all of that stand or fall on how much enforcement you've got?
Yes. If you don't have sensors, it obviously becomes a lot easier with sensors, because you can record, the sensor will flag when someone has been there for too long and hasn't paid. Yeah. So I think Wellington's actually in a pretty good situation, at least in the places where they have sensors. But yeah, definitely does rely a little bit on enforcement. Yeah.
Quickly on park and ride, and this is a big one for us, because we have this great, we've got good PT usage, but definitely not what it could be. Should all park and rides be charged for? What implications would that have?
Yeah, definitely. If there's excessive demand, I think the same principle applies. It's important to point out here that you're not pricing parking to make money or to maximize profit necessarily. You're pricing parking because you're trying to manage demand at a certain high level. And so the price that you charge for parking will typically be slightly less than what you would charge if you were trying to maximize your profit. So it's not like that you're going to go and park. You're not going to go and charge the market rate for your parking rides. You know, the market rate might be $10 a day, but if you get excessive demand for parking, I don't see at a particular parking ride. I don't see why you would not charge for it. And that's particularly in the situation where a lot of parking rides end up in Auckland and Brisbane and probably Wellington too, where they're actually full before the morning peak really begins.
Yeah.
And that's a real issue, right? If one of the primary drivers that we're providing public transport, not the only driver, but one of the drivers is to reduce congestion, and we're spending all of this money on expensive parking rides, and yet the parking rides are full before the roads are really that congested. So definitely think charging for parking ride makes sense. I wouldn't expect it to be a market rate. But I did a back of the envelope calculation the other day for Auckland, and what sort of revenue they might be able to raise if they charged a reasonable rate for their parking rides. They have about 6,000 car parking ride spaces, I think, maybe a few more now. But it's in the millions of dollars per year. So it's not insignificant. And millions of dollars per year is going to fund a couple of high frequency bus routes. So that's kind of the opportunity costs we're talking about here.
Nice. We're bearing down on 1:30, and you have a toddler, and it's important that we don't take up your entire evening. We've covered heaps of stuff, and there's heaps more to ask, and we will definitely be sending out your slides and any additional further reading and some good links. We've seen some good links coming through in the chat as well. From perhaps your perspective as I'll hesitate to say an advocate, but also as the citizen of Auckland who's working as an active and civic-minded citizen to try and get some good change, as well as a researcher and a consultant. When you're looking at where Wellington is right now and looking at the journey that we have to a better functioning system of parking generally, let's assume that this policy gets the tick and gets adopted. Over the next sort of 6 months to a year, if you were to sort of lick your finger and hold it in the air and give us a sense of where we, people who care, should be putting our effort.
I think the really big question is a strategic question that I haven't really spoken much about today, because we've been more focused on the management aspect of things, which makes sense given this draft policy proposal that you're submitting on. There's a little bit in there on the strategic question around where should you provide parking and how much should you provide. We haven't really spoken so much about that, but I think one supports the other. So managing parking really effectively makes it easier to go into a street and take out parking on one side to put in a cycle lane, because what it means is that there will be a few spaces available on the other side of the street. Yes, it's possible that you're then going to have to put up prices a little bit because there's going to be more demand because you've removed parking. But this whole, rather pragmatic and practical approach to, I'm a bit biased obviously, approach to parking management does enable some of these more strategic gains around, actually we need to reconsider how we're using our road space, our road corridor, and parking is not really the best use of space. So it has that wider opportunity cost. So I think thinking 6 months down the track, what I would be really hoping for is that with this policy, you're starting to see the complaints about insufficient parking going away. That's the first step. And I don't say that because we're providing more parking or anything. It's just that we're managing what we have better. And that means that people should be able to park more easily when they need it. they might have to pay, but there will be a car park for them. Once you get to that stage where the complaints start to dry up, and this happened in Auckland quite noticeably, and also the number of parking tickets will go down because enforcement becomes easier and compliance becomes easier. So basically all of the grizzles and grumbling and whining, or not all, but a lot, that you currently hear should go away. That's the first win. And then, you know, you can start to rip out parking and put in cycle lanes. At least that's what I hope. But I'm probably a little bit optimistic about that. But I do think these sorts of parking management policies, if they're implemented well, can be really, really useful for helping you with those bigger strategic questions where you do need to remove parking. And I think, you know, it's pretty clear that you will need to put out, you know, to get a high quality cycling network, you're going to need to remove parking. So this is going to help you do that. It doesn't answer all the question. You still need people willing to stand up and fight for, you know, the infrastructure, but it helps. Yeah. And
we've also got some quite grand ambitions for mass transit and pedestrianising, all those sorts of things. Yeah, space for that too. Last quick question on that point. We obviously have some energy to put towards the issue of parking, given that people have decided to put some time in their evenings to it. Are we best to sort of nag at councillors, or should we, you know, try and generate some kind of public groundswell of something? What have you got a quick tactical comment?
I would definitely encourage you to engage with your elected representatives. I think you, with the rare exception, you might find they're actually relatively pleasant people. And I think they would like to hear from people who give them a different perspective they'd like to hear from people about parking who aren't complaining about parking. And you know, like that experience, those negative experiences that people have because of how we currently manage parking, they flow regularly up to these elected representatives. They get battered with them, you know, all the time. So if you can just engage with your elected reps in a supportive and understanding way, you know, and validate those concerns, but say, you know, make them aware that the best policy response is not just to provide more parking. If you provide more parking in a very short space of time, that will fill up again and you'll be back at the same point. You know, that's what we know about travel demands in urban areas, is that basically there's just an enormous amount of pent up travel demand. And if you keep trying to accommodate that through infrastructure, then you're going to fail. You're going to spend lots of money. You're going to spend lots of money and fail, especially for cars, because they're congestible. So, and space intensive. So yeah, that would be the key point. Engage, and just point them towards this different path and let them know that there's support for it. I think that's a good first step. But also talk to your family. Yeah, that's a good place to try.
And your neighbours and the people in the dairy. Great.
Yeah.
Look, we're pretty much at time. I would like to invite everybody to give Stu a silent round of applause. Thank you so much for that very thoughtful and interesting discussion. Folks, we are going to be sending out an follow-up email with a lot of the gold nuggets that have come out of this conversation. If you haven't already submitted on Wellington's parking policy, there's a whole bunch of very useful guidance, including some guidance for people who only have 5 minutes. And we will be sharing that. It's coming from a whole bunch of different, very thoughtful advocacy groups who are doing the hard yards and reading the policy so that you don't have to. Although it is fascinating, you should definitely get in there and read it. If you would like to get connected to communities of people who are interested in these kinds of nerdy urban issues, Oliver Bruce and I convene a drinks, which is both virtual and physical. It's called the Urban Nerds Drinks. It is what it says on the tin. You're an urban nerd, you come together and nerd over drinks. We'll send the link out to the sign-up form for that. And you can also sign up for the rare but extremely useful update emails from Talk Wellington. And Councillor Jenny Condy is the councillor who is doing all the hard yards behind Wellington's parking policy, and we will hopefully be able to gather the good support and vibes and encouragements for better that we're seeing in this hui today, and help put them behind her work and a trajectory towards much better managed parking in Wellington. So thank you very much to TUI Climate Community and to millions of mothers, Alicia and Melanie, for hosting us tonight. Thank you again to Stuart Donovan, our expert on parking. Thanks to all of you for participating and for your really insightful questions and conversation. We look forward to seeing lots of rich submissions going into the parking policy and to our city becoming a better place for us all to be. Thank you very much, and we'll see you around. Ka kite.